Hey guys, welcome back to Boring History Episodes. Tonight, we're not diving into the chronicles of kings, we're not following the footsteps of legendary warriors. Instead, we step into the quiet darkness of history, where faith was twisted and the line between devotion and torment blurred. This isn't the Ottoman Empire of grandeur and conquest. This is the hidden side, the one that was far less glorious, far more brutal. Tonight, we'll be unraveling the terrifying fate of Christian nuns during the Ottoman invasion. To see how their sacred lives, their vows of devotion, were shattered by an unimaginable cruelty of Ottomans, far worse than death itself. Imagine this. The year is 1453. The sun sets over the hills of Thessaly, casting long shadows over the convents and churches. But there is no peace. The distant sound of marching soldiers grows louder. The banners of the Ottoman Empire flutter in the wind, and the nuns know their sanctuary is about to be broken. Behind the walls they pray for mercy, for survival. But the reality awaiting them is far worse than anything they could have imagined. Their bodies, their faith, their very souls, all to be stripped away by those who claim to bring divine conquest. You're waking up now, the cold stone floor against your skin, the air thick with the smell of incense and burning wood. You stand, your heart racing. The distant sound of boots echoes down the hall. You step toward the window, and through the cracked glass, you see the banners waving. You touch the fabric of your habit, its rough texture reminding you of the vows you've taken. But today, those vows will be tested in ways you never thought possible. If this chilling chapter of history fascinates you, and you want to uncover more hidden stories that time tried to bury, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. Where are you tuning in from tonight? I'd love to know. Drop a comment, and let's see how far these stories have traveled. Now, dim the lights. Let the soft hum of the world outside fade away. Take a slow breath in. Feel the cool air fill your lungs, and let the heaviness of history settle around you. Close your eyes for a moment. Listen closely. Can you hear the distant whispers of the past? The air is thick with the weight of forgotten voices, and the shadows of those who lived through this darkness. Now picture this. You stand in a convent, 1453, the stone walls weathered by time, but still standing tall against the threat of invasion. Outside, the world is falling apart, and inside, you are left to wonder, what will become of your sacred vows when the walls fall? Because the truth is, the terror awaiting these nuns was far worse than anything you could ever imagine. The sound of hooves grew louder, closer now, with the rhythmic clatter of marching soldiers echoing through the valley. It wasn't the calm, steady beat of the land anymore. It was the harbinger of destruction. The walls of the convent, once strong and defiant, trembled at the approaching sound, and for so long they had stood untouched by the world beyond, a sanctuary, a refuge. But now they were only a reminder of what was about to be lost. The first stones of the convent collapsed before sundown, and the hymns that once filled those halls were drowned out by iron and screams. The Ottomans didn't waste arrows on holy places. They shattered the gates with cannon fire, both a warning and a declaration. To them, a convent wasn't sacred ground. It was a symbol of defiance, proof that the cross still dared to rise in conquered soil. Inside, the sisters hid their relics, silver chalices, embroidered icons, and fragments of Saint bones buried beneath the chapel floor. They believed that if their bodies were lost, their faith might still endure. The nuns, pale and still, could feel the tension in the air, a heaviness, a stillness, the kind you feel just before something breaks. The abbey bell rang once, but it wasn't a call to prayer. It was a mournful toll, and then The doors were breached. No arrows, no swords. The Ottoman army wasn't interested in the usual methods of war. No, they brought something more destructive. A cannon. The gates, once sturdy and resolute, splintered under the force, and the sound echoed through the convent like thunder. Then, silence. The heavy doors, which had kept the nuns safe for so long, were gone, and so too was their sense of safety. The soldiers poured in, their boots heavy on the stone floor. The banners, red, dark, flapped above them. The light from the setting sun caught the edges, making them seem even more ominous. The nuns stood frozen, and in the distance they could hear the calls of their invaders. But it wasn't for them. It wasn't for the holy relics that filled the convent. They didn't care about the sacred objects, the crosses, the chalices, the ancient scrolls. They were just relics to be discarded. What mattered was the faith these women held. What mattered was breaking it, shattering it into pieces. As if by destroying their faith, the nuns would be left hollow, without purpose, without hope. The nuns scrambled. They hid what they could, under floorboards, behind walls, in dark corners. But it didn't matter. The soldiers weren't here for the relics. They were here to conquer, to dominate. They were here to take away everything the nuns had believed in. The soldiers didn't speak in words of reverence. They moved like shadows, ruthless, sweeping through the halls. Their laughter echoed in the corners of the chapel. The nuns, silent, watched, their hearts racing, but there was nothing they could do. The silence before the storm was long gone. Now, it was the storm itself. The soldiers tore through the convent with a cold, practiced precision. Books were thrown to the ground, pages torn. Statues were smashed. The marble floors were cracked underfoot. No care, no respect, just destruction. Complete, unyielding destruction. And in the middle of it all, the nuns held their ground. They didn't run. They didn't flee. There was nowhere to go. There was nothing left to protect, just the knowledge that soon the last remnants of their sacred space would be gone. The soldiers didn't care about the sacred or the holy. To them, the convent was just another fortress to be taken, a symbol of resistance that had to be destroyed. And so, the destruction continued. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't chaotic. No, this was different. Slow, methodical, each blow, each strike, deliberate. The sound of the cannon fire echoed through the air like thunder, shaking the very earth beneath their feet. At first, it was just the gates, crashing open, splintering wood, the sound so final, so irreversible. But then the walls began to crumble, one piece at a time, a crack here, a shudder there. And soon enough, the towering stone walls, which had been standing guard for centuries, began to lose their strength. The once mighty walls, so thick and impenetrable, were now no more than rubble. Each stone, once perfectly placed, now shattered like glass under the weight of the army's relentless force. The doors, once sturdy, welcoming, a barrier between the chaos outside and the safety within, were gone. What remained was only a jagged frame, empty. Where the heavy wood had once rested, solid and unyielding, now there was nothing, just emptiness. The sound of destruction was relentless, a constant roar echoing through every corridor of the convent. Stone crumbled, wood splintered, glass shattered into millions of tiny, helpless pieces, each piece falling to the ground with a quiet finality, like the last breath of a dying world. The nuns could hear it all, standing still, frozen, as the world around them fell apart. The sanctuary, the place they had dedicated their lives to, was vanishing in front of their eyes. Gone, shattered. There was nothing left, nothing to hide behind. The walls had protected them for so long. But now, those walls were gone. Just like that. And with it, any hope of shelter. There were no sacred relics to comfort them either. The chalices, the crosses, the scrolls, they meant nothing now. Those symbols of faith, of hope, of resistance had been reduced to mere objects, pieces of broken history. What remained? Just the cold, bitter reality. The walls were gone. The door was gone. The sanctuary was gone. And the nuns knew it. The silence that followed the destruction was deafening. It wasn't peaceful. It wasn't a reprieve. It was a void, a space where everything that had once been certain, once sacred, was no more. The smell of smoke and ash lingered in the air. It was heavy, thick, like the weight of an ending. The banners of the Ottoman Empire still fluttered, but now they no longer seemed so grand. Just fabric in the wind, nothing more, nothing sacred. Just a reminder of the devastation that had been wrought. The nuns, exhausted, stood amidst the wreckage, their hearts heavy. The chapel was gone, their sanctuary now a tomb of broken dreams. But in the silence that followed, one thing was certain. The soldiers had come, and in their wake they left nothing. Nothing but a void. The bells of the convent tolled for the last time, echoing through the stillness that filled the hills of Thessaly, where olive trees shivered in the autumn wind. A small band of nuns gathered inside their fading chapel, praying beneath cracked frescoes, saints with faces long scraped away by age and sorrow. On the horizon, fire shimmered, signaling the threat that approached. The nuns in Thessaly had always known the silence of their sanctuary, the stillness that filled their chapel, where their prayers echoed off the walls, had always been comforting, a steady rhythm they relied on for peace. But today, that silence felt different. There was an unease hanging in the air, something not quite right, something waiting to break. The air inside the convent was thick with it, and the stone walls, once firm and strong, now seemed to groan under the weight of time. The frescoes adorning the walls, delicate works of art full of saints and angels, were peeling. The paint was chipped, and faces once vibrant were fading into nothingness, their features becoming ghostly. The very church itself was falling apart, a quiet metaphor for the world outside, a world slipping into chaos. The nuns sat in their prayer positions, their hands clasped, and their murmurs the only sound breaking the stillness. They had always relied on this ritual, the calm, the repetition of prayer, the sense of safety that came with routine. But today, even the prayers seemed different, as though the words couldn't quite catch hold of the air, as if the weight of it all hung in the room, making their voices feel strained. Outside, the wind began to pick up. A low, rumbling breeze whipped through the olive trees, their twisted branches scraping against the walls of the convent like nails on a chalkboard. It should have been peaceful, soothing, but instead, it felt like a warning. The nuns couldn't have known, but they could feel it deep down in their bones, like a smell in the air just before rain. Then came the sound of hooves, faint at first, barely perceptible, but growing steadily louder, echoing off the hills like a distant drum. The sound wasn't unfamiliar. Horses had trotted through this land for centuries. But this was different. This was an army. The nuns didn't speak. They didn't need to. They could feel it, deep down, in their bones. The calm before the storm. But it wasn't just the sound of the hooves that made their hearts race. It was what came next. The flutter of banners, red banners dark against the sky. The Ottoman banners. The flags snapped in the wind, casting long, eerie shadows across the convent grounds. The nuns had seen those flags before, from a distance, but now they were up close. And with them came a cold reality. The soldiers were here, and the walls of their sanctuary were no longer enough to protect them. In that moment, everything changed. The stillness, the silence, the false sense of security, they were all shattered. Sister Eleni, the abbess, stood in front of the altar, her hands steady despite the chaos unfolding outside. She looked down at the crucifix, an ancient symbol of faith, one that had survived centuries of storms. But in that moment, it was just a symbol, wasn't it? A relic, a reminder of something that no longer had any power. Her voice cut through the quiet chapel, though it was soft, barely above a whisper. If they breach our walls, keep your vows inside your hearts that they cannot take. The nuns nodded. They all knew. The vows would be all they had left. They had given up their bodies to God long ago, but now it was their souls they had to protect. And there was nothing they could do to stop it. The Ottoman Empire was vast, relentless, and unyielding. What hope did a small convent have against that? The bells rang, not the celebratory chime of morning mass, but a slow, solemn toll. The sound drifted through the air, as if the very earth was acknowledging the inevitability of what was coming. The banners fluttered harder in the wind, their edges now sharp and defined against the sky. The nuns didn't speak. What could they say? Their lives, their years of service, the years they had spent in prayer, in devotion, in sacrifice. It was all slipping away. The walls that had sheltered them for so long were no longer enough, and the thought of what awaited them outside the convent gates made the air feel even heavier, colder. The first soldier crossed the threshold. A tall figure, his silhouette dark against the sky. The sound of his boots on the stone was sharp, final. A cold wind swept through the convent, snuffing out the remaining candlelight, leaving only the shadows behind. The nuns looked at each other. Their faces were pale, but they didn't flinch. They couldn't. They were resigned. There was no way out. The world had closed in around them, and the soldiers were here. It was over. And so, they prepared. But what could they do? Prepare for death, prepare for the unimaginable, prepare for whatever came next. There was no hope left, just survival. The wind outside howled, the banners snapped louder, a constant reminder of what was about to unfold. And in the silence that followed, the nuns could only wait for the inevitable, knowing that nothing would ever be the same again. Not now, not ever. The convent, once a place of peace, was now a battlefield. The nuns stood in the courtyard, their hands bound, their heads bowed. The walls that had shielded them, the doors that had once welcomed them, gone. Now they were nothing but prisoners. The soldiers marched around them, their boots heavy on the stone ground. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, dust, and the remnants of what had been. The nuns didn't speak. What was there left to say? And yet, in the midst of their conquest, one woman stood unyielding. Abbess Eleni. She was a figure of quiet defiance, the crucifix still clutched tightly in her hands. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the scene, shadows that stretched across the stone courtyard, as if the day itself was reluctant to bear witness to what was unfolding. Her heart raced, but her face remained calm, serene even. This was not the first time she had faced danger. No, Eleni had spent her life in devotion. She had long ago given her body, her mind, her soul to God. But today, she had been asked to give up more than just her body. She had been asked to renounce her faith. The leader of the Ottoman soldiers approached her. He was tall, his face hard, his eyes narrow as he studied her. His voice was smooth, practiced, almost comforting as he spoke to her. Renounce your faith, and you will live. You will be spared the horrors of what is to come. But Eleni wasn't listening to his words. She was listening to the sound of her own heartbeat. It was steady. It was sure. She had already made her decision. It wasn't just a choice in that moment. It was the culmination of everything she had ever believed in, ever fought for. Her faith was her life. Her life was her faith. "I have already given my life," she said, her voice steady, though the world around her seemed to fall apart. "Is there anything left you can take from me?" Her words were simple, direct, but they carried the weight of a lifetime's devotion. The leader faltered for a moment, as though her response had caught him off guard. It was supposed to be easy. It was supposed to be a simple surrender. He was wrong. This wasn't a battle to be won with force. It was a battle of will, of heart. And Eleni's heart was not for the taking. The soldiers shifted uneasily, unsure how to respond. The tension in the air thickened. But the leader, unshaken, took a step closer. He reached out and, with a swift motion, tried to seize the crucifix from her hands. But Eleni did not give in. She stepped back, her grip tightening on the cross, her fingers white with the force of her will. "Take my life, if you must," she said softly, but there was no tremor in her voice. "But my faith, you will never have that." It was an echo of a truth she had known since the day she first walked into the convent, a truth she had lived by. And now, at this moment, as the world around her crumbled, it was the only thing she had left to cling to. Her faith was not something to be surrendered, not even for her own life. The leader paused. The tension stretched between them, like the pull of a taut rope, ready to snap. He studied her, as if weighing the worth of her words. There was no hesitation in her gaze, no fear in her eyes, just resolve, unwavering resolve. She had nothing left to lose, and that made her stronger than any sword. The leader's hand dropped, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though he might relent. But that was not the way of war, and it was not the way of conquest. He had no time for defiance, no time for anything other than the submission he expected. Without another word, the soldiers closed in around Eleni. The courtyard was filled with the sounds of armor clanking, the rustle of soldiers moving, their breath heavy in the thickening air. Eleni stood tall, as if the weight of the world was not enough to make her bend. And perhaps it wasn't. She had already given everything she had, her life, her vows, her service. What more could they take? The soldiers moved toward her, but in that moment, she knew. There was nothing they could take that would matter. They could break her body. They could take her life. But her soul, her faith, those were hers alone. The leader, growing impatient, gave a signal, and the soldiers advanced. There was no more discussion, no more words, only the swift, cold hands of fate moving forward. The nuns watched from the sidelines, their hearts in their throats, but none of them moved. They knew what was coming. They had all known. Eleni's gaze did not falter. She stared at the leader, her eyes locked with his, as if to say, "This is my choice." The moments stretched on. The sound of the soldiers' steps grew louder, closer. There would be no retreat, no turning back. For her. For them. And then, as the first of the soldiers reached for her, Eleni's voice rang out, clear and unwavering. "I stand with God," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Nothing in this world can take that from me." Her words lingered in the air, hanging heavy, a final declaration of everything she stood for. She had made her choice, and in that choice, she had found her end. The courtyard fell silent. The wind had stopped. The air was thick with the weight of the moment. It was over. But as the soldiers moved in to finish what they had started, Eleni remained unbroken. She had nothing left but her faith. And in that faith, she had already found peace. The ruins of the convent were still fresh in their minds, with shattered walls that once formed a beautiful sanctuary, now reduced to a heap of broken stone and dust. The cries of the nuns had faded, lost to the wind that swept through the empty halls, leaving behind only the 22 who remained, still standing, still breathing, now bound by something stronger than the chains around their wrists, survival, and something more, a quiet, undying resolve. The soldiers, indifferent to the destruction, had secured their victory, but their mission was far from over. The nuns, now prisoners, had a long journey ahead of them, a relentless march that would take them to Volos. It was not just a physical journey through heat and dust, but a test of their very existence, each step weighing heavily on their bodies, tethering their spirits to something beyond mere survival, something invisible yet unbreakable. Though the soldiers remained ever watchful, forcing them forward without sparing a glance, the nuns walked with an unspoken dignity. Their bodies may have been tattered, their faces gaunt, and their clothes torn, but their spirits remained intact. Their solidarity was not in words, but in the way they walked, in the quiet prayers they shared, in the silence that spoke volumes of their shared suffering and faith. As they walked, exhaustion settled in their bones, but they did not stop. The path ahead stretched endlessly before them, and the landscape around them was a strange kind of beauty. Barren hills on one side, the distant rumble of the sea on the other. The sun beat down mercilessly, and every breath they took was filled with dust. Yet even in that stifling heat, they kept moving. There was no need for words to express the pain. They understood it in the heavy silence that enveloped them. They were together, and that was all that mattered. Water was a luxury they could barely afford, rationed carefully as it passed from hand to hand. The soldiers drank freely, their laughter echoing harshly in the heat, an ugly contrast to the quiet dignity of the nuns. Despite the disparity between captor and captive, the nuns did not bow or beg. They simply endured, and in their endurance, they found strength. In moments of unbearable pain, when the soldiers grew too close, or the weight of their chains seemed unbearable, the nuns whispered prayers. These were prayers for strength, mercy, and for the others who walked beside them, sharing the same suffering. In those quiet moments, when time seemed to slow down, they found a piece of grace, a small comfort in the midst of their hardship. Each resting point, whether a small village or a creek, became a brief oasis where they could catch their breath and drink a few precious drops of water. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep them going. They sat together, shoulder to shoulder, heads bent, their bodies finding rest in each other's company before the march resumed. The soldiers remained vigilant, always scanning for any sign of resistance, any hint that the nuns might try to escape. But the nuns knew there was no escape. The only way forward was through the march, until they reached Volos, where their fate awaited. Each night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, they found a place to sleep on the cold, hard earth. Huddled together for warmth, the stars above them were the only reminder of the world beyond their pain. In the quiet of the night, with the wind stirring the branches above them, they spoke softly, words of comfort, prayers, and shared memories. They did not know if they would see another sunrise, but they lived for that fleeting moment of connection, for the bond they shared. The journey was strange. The soldiers had taken everything: home, security, the faces of their fellow sisters. But as they walked, something grew within them. Despite the soldiers' cruelty, despite the heat and hunger, they still had each other. They still had their faith, and that was enough to keep them moving forward, one foot in front of the other. The road to Volos was longer than any of them could have imagined, but through it, they discovered something that could never be taken from them. Something that would endure even in the darkest of moments. In their shared faith and silent solidarity, they found strength, hope, and the will to continue. The journey, though grueling, was a testament to what they could endure when they had each other. The landscape shifted again, and the distant port city finally came into view. The road, though long and hard, had led them here, and although they did not know what awaited them in Volos, they had walked through it all together, and that, in itself, was something. The walls of Topkapi Palace breathe differently at night. During the day they echo with footsteps, orders, and the sharp ring of steel meeting stone. But when the torches dim and the halls fall silent, something else stirs in the dark. Whispers, prayers, and soft hymns that no one dares to speak aloud under the sun. The nuns live in that silence. They've learned how to move within it, how to speak without words, and how to survive without hope. They are not free, not by any stretch, but in a place built on conquest and pride, they found a peculiar kind of liberty, the freedom of the soul, a kind that no lock, no guard, and no empire can touch. By day, they are laborers, servants with no names, folding linens that never belong to them, scrubbing marble floors that reflect only other people's power. They are dressed in coarse fabric that chafes their skin, the smell of soap and metal clinging to their hands. They do not speak unless spoken to. They are invisible, and in their invisibility, they endure. Sometimes, one of the soldiers watches them a little too long, or the overseer's voice cuts sharp through the air. But mostly, the world forgets they exist, and maybe that's a mercy. Because in the shadows, they are alive in ways the soldiers will never be. It begins quietly. One look, one nod, one silent understanding. When the palace sleeps, they descend into the underbelly of the empire's heart. Down staircases no one cleans anymore, through doors no one opens, into the earth itself. There, beneath the palace, is their chapel, not built of gold or marble, not adorned with icons or candles, but just dirt, stone, and silence. A space carved by devotion, not permission. The air is damp, the ground cold, but the faith here burns warmer than any fire above. They gather in small groups, faces half lit by the dim glow of a hidden lantern. Hands clasped together, trembling, not from fear, but from reverence. The prayers are whispered, not because they are afraid of being heard, but because they know that true faith doesn't need to shout. In this small, secret world beneath the empire, they reclaim what was taken, their names, their voices, their God. They remember who they were, not servants, not captives, but women of faith. They speak of the past in fragments, the sound of bells ringing across the valley of Thessaly, the way sunlight used to pour through stained glass, the quiet rustle of pages turning in the old chapel library. These memories become their psalms, each one a resurrection. The palace above is restless. Empires rarely sleep peacefully, and the sound of distant laughter drifts down from the upper halls, the faint clink of goblets, and the heavy, weary breathing of those who believe themselves untouchable. But the empire does not know that beneath its feet, faith still breathes, softly, steadily. Every act of obedience during the day, every bucket of water carried, every floor scrubbed, is a disguise, a performance. The soldiers see submission, but it's not submission. It's patience, endurance dressed as compliance. One of the nuns, Sister Theodora, keeps a scrap of linen hidden under her sleeve. She embroidered a small cross on it, using threads pulled from her hem. It's the size of her palm, and yet it carries the weight of a cathedral. At night, she presses it to her lips, a quiet reminder that not all holy things need walls. Sometimes holiness is something small enough to hide in your hand. Another nun hums while she works, a hymn from the old days, soft enough that it blends with the sound of scrubbing. No one notices, but those close to her know. They hear it, they understand. And when she finishes the verse, she does not need applause. The song itself is enough, Faith doesn't have to be loud to be powerful. It can live quietly beneath stone, beneath fear, beneath the weight of an empire. It survives like roots in dry soil, waiting for rain, but never dying. Sometimes when dawn breaks, they hear the muezzin's call to prayer echo across the city. The soldiers kneel in the open courtyards, and for a moment, the empire feels invincible again. The nuns stand far away, listening, and in that shared silence, they pray too, for peace, for forgiveness, for the strength to remain who they are. Their prayers mingle with the morning air, unheard by the powerful, but carried by the wind nonetheless. A quiet reminder that, even in captivity, the soul can still reach upward. Years pass this way, and the palace forgets them entirely. Some of the younger nuns grow old within its walls. Their hair turns silver, their backs stoop, but their eyes, those remain clear, bright, even. They've seen cruelty, but they've also seen grace survive it. And that is a sight most people in the empire never know. The secret chapel grows smaller over time as the earth shifts and the walls close in. Still, they gather. Still, they pray. They whisper the same words that have carried them through every hardship. And in those whispers there is power. There is defiance. Because prayer, to them, is not just faith. It's memory. It's rebellion. It's a refusal to disappear. The empire will continue. The soldiers will come and go. The walls of Topkapi will crumble someday, as all things built by men eventually do. But beneath those stones, somewhere deep underfoot, the echoes of those prayers will remain, small, steady, indestructible. And maybe that's the truest kind of victory. Not conquest, not glory, just endurance. Just faith that never stopped whispering, even when the world demanded silence. The days in Topkapi Palace stretched on, one after another, a blur of monotony as the sun rose and set. But the nuns barely noticed anymore. Time had become something they could no longer grasp, each day blending into the next, unbroken, unchanging, a silent procession of hours. The palace, grand as it was, seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment, its walls closing in, its halls stretching endlessly in every direction, offering no escape, no reprieve. But the nuns, they kept moving, their feet barely making a sound against the cold marble floors, their steps deliberate and measured, their heads bent low as if the weight of the world rested on their necks. They had learned to move through the palace this way, invisible, unnoticed, a presence that didn't quite exist in the world of the palace. It wasn't the freedom they once had, but it was survival, what they could do, and they did it with a quiet grace that no one could take from them. Their bodies might have been bound by chains, but their spirits were free. And so, they moved in the shadows, navigating the silence that had become their world. There was no sound to break the stillness, no loud conversations, no laughter, no music, only the soft shuffle of their feet as they carried out their tasks. But even in this silence, their faith remained, thriving in the quiet spaces, in the moments when the palace was at rest, when no one else was watching, and the air felt thick with something unspoken. The nuns had learned how to live in those spaces between words, those moments of stillness where nothing seemed to matter but the next breath. In these silent moments, they prayed, not loudly, not for show, but softly within their hearts, where only they could hear. Their prayers were whispered in the dark corners of the palace, in the chambers where no one would think to look for them. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to keep them going, one day at a time. Enough to remind them that they were still there, still holding on, still refusing to let the world take everything. Because even in the silence, their faith still thrived. It was a quiet rebellion, an act of defiance against the world that sought to erase them, But the world could not take their faith. Not now. Not ever. They moved through the palace, their eyes always downcast, their voices always hushed, but inside, they carried something unbreakable, something that could not be seen, could not be touched. But that was the one thing the palace could not steal from them, their faith, their hope. And as long as they had that, they could keep moving. They could keep living, even in the silence. But then, the soldiers came with a new demand, a simple request, if you could call it that. Renounce your faith and live. Accept the new order, and your life will be spared. It was a choice between life and death, one many had already made. Some of the nuns, their bodies weakened and spirits exhausted, had already surrendered, accepting the false comfort of survival, bowing their heads to the new rule. What was faith after all, when everything else had been taken? But not all of them. Not all were willing to let go. Magdalena, one of the youngest nuns, her body still full of energy and her mind sharp, had seen suffering and death. But what she had not seen was a reason to let go of her belief. What was survival without faith? She stood in the center of the gathering, the others around her watching with bated breath. Some had already turned away, some had already embraced the inevitable, but Magdalena stood tall, her hands clasped in front of her, her gaze steady and unwavering. "I cannot renounce what I have given my life to," she said, her voice soft but firm. She didn't shout, she didn't scream, she simply spoke the truth that no one could take away, no matter the soldiers, no matter the palace. It was a simple choice, really. Renounce her faith, live but without purpose, or die, holding on to something that mattered. And for Magdalena, the choice was clear. The soldiers watched her for a moment, their expressions unreadable, the silence stretching, thick and heavy in the air. But she did not flinch. She did not look away. Her hands were trembling, but only because she was human. Her soul was still standing tall. As the others wavered, as some began to bow their heads and accept the new rule, Magdalena remained steady. She became the anchor, the one who held the line, and in that moment, she became the strength the others needed, though they didn't know it yet. And so, the days passed. The palace, with its bright gold and cold marble, remained silent. But the nuns, they found ways to endure. Magdalena led them, speaking softly to them in the stillness of their captivity, reminding them of the strength they still had, reminding them of their faith, even in the darkest places. They prayed in the quiet corners of the palace, in places where no one could hear them. Their prayers, though whispered, were like a storm gathering in the distance, slow, steady, unyielding. And in the midst of the cold stone walls, they found something, a sense of purpose, a reason to keep going, a reason to keep fighting, not with weapons or words, but with the quiet resistance of their hearts. Magdalena's voice, though soft, became the thread that held them together. Her belief, unshakable, anchored the others when they wavered. In the dead of night, when the guards slept, they gathered in secret, sharing what little they had. Prayers, memories, stories. They would speak of the old days, of the convent before it was lost, of the sounds of bells ringing, the warmth of the sun on their faces, the smell of fresh bread in the air. And as they whispered, they found a strange comfort in the words. It wasn't the comfort of a warm home. It wasn't the comfort of safety. But it was the comfort of knowing that they were not alone. Magdalena did not allow them to forget. She reminded them of what they had lost, but also of what they still had. Their faith, their bond, their will to survive. Not just in body, but in spirit. When the soldiers came, they looked for those who were weak, those who would bend, those who would break. But they couldn't find that in Magdalena. She was not weak, she was not broken, and so she led them, with soft words, with gentle strength, with the quiet resilience that had become her signature. She did not need to raise her voice. Her faith, her conviction, her unwavering belief in something greater than herself, that was enough. Her defiance was not loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was enough. Because sometimes the greatest strength is found in the silence, in the stillness, in the refusal to give in, even when everything else is taken. Magdalena stood at the heart of the silence, not as a leader in the traditional sense, but as something far more profound. She had become a symbol, not just of endurance, but of resistance. A reminder that even in the darkest of places, in the deepest silence, there is power. Power that is not loud. Power that doesn't need to be seen to be real. Her strength was not in the clanging of swords or the defiance in her voice. It was in her stillness, her refusal to bend. Even when everything around her seemed to crumble, even when her world had been reduced to this cold, imposing palace, she held on to the one thing that no one could take, her faith. And so, the days passed, one after another. The palace remained still, but the nuns, they were more than just prisoners. They were survivors. They were rebels. And no matter how small the act, they would continue to resist. The nuns moved through the palace like shadows, silent and unseen, their eyes downcast, their steps measured. But in that silence, they held on to something that no one could take, something that could never be erased, their faith. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, and it didn't make a sound when it lived or when it died, but it was there. The soldiers, with their harsh eyes and sharper words, watched them closely. They saw the stillness, the quiet resignation, and they mistook it for weakness. They whispered among themselves, saying these women were broken, that they were nothing. They did not fight, they did not beg, they did not cry. But they were wrong. The nuns did not need to beg. They did not need to fight with swords or shouts. No, their resistance was far quieter. It was in the way they moved through the halls, not with the force of the defiant, but with the grace of the faithful. They held their heads high, not because they were proud, but because they were steady. They moved like the earth beneath them, silent, unyielding. It was strange the way the world saw them. To the guards, they were weak. To their captors, they were a curiosity, women who refused to break. The soldiers laughed. They called them foolish. They thought the nuns had no will left, that they were ghosts in a palace of flesh and power. But they didn't know. They didn't see. The nuns, in their quiet strength, had found a way to fight back. Not with force, not with defiance, but with small, simple acts. It started with the walls, a scratch here, a symbol there. Nothing obvious, nothing that would catch the eye of the soldiers. But they were there, carved into the stone, etched in the silence, tiny marks, crosses, scriptures, symbols of hope, small enough to hide beneath the surface. Each mark was an act of defiance, but it was more than that. It was a promise that their faith would not be erased, that no matter how tightly the walls closed in, no matter how much the palace tried to swallow them whole, they would remain. They would be there. The soldiers didn't understand. They looked at the nuns and saw only women without power. They didn't see the defiance in the quiet. They didn't hear the prayers whispered in the dark. And they didn't notice the tiny carvings on the walls, symbols of faith that would never be removed. And so the days passed. The nuns did not stop. They did not speak loudly, but they did not need to. Their faith was strong, stronger than the chains that held them, stronger than the walls that tried to silence them. They had learned the power of silence. In the stillness of their days, they found strength. They found resistance in the smallest of actions, in the carving of a symbol on the wall, in the sharing of a whispered prayer, and in the quiet exchange of looks, of understanding. The world may not have seen it, but the nuns knew, and that was enough. They didn't need to be seen to be strong. They didn't need to shout to resist. Their actions spoke louder than any words ever could, and in that silence, they won. The palace continued on around them, the world outside unaware of the rebellion that was silently taking place. But the nuns knew, and they knew what they had. They had something stronger than fear, stronger than captivity. They had faith, and no one could take that from them. Their rebellion, though quiet, was more powerful than anything the soldiers could throw at them, because in the end, faith can't be silenced, faith can't be taken, and that was the one thing the nuns held on to, the one thing no one could ever steal from them. In the quiet recesses of history, the nuns of Topkapi Palace were meant to fade away, their names erased, their existence wiped from the official records. In the eyes of the Ottoman Empire, they were nothing more than ghosts. Quiet figures who never made a sound, never caused a stir, but who were nonetheless deemed to be forgotten. The palace, with its vast halls and grandeur, had no room for them, not in its archives, not in its stories, but in the spaces between those stories, in the cracks where history hides, the nuns' presence lingered. They couldn't be erased, not entirely. History, it seems, has a habit of preserving the things it least expects. The walls of the palace, though polished and grand, held the marks of what had been. Small carvings, faint sketches, symbols that no one saw, but that had remained, etched deep in the stone. Quiet acts of defiance, quiet acts of faith. These marks weren't loud. They didn't shout, they didn't demand attention, but in their stillness, they spoke louder than any army ever could. In the hidden corners of Topkapi, beneath the floors and between the cracks, the nuns' rebellion, small, silent, subtle, had been left behind. It wasn't much. A cross here, a prayer there. Nothing that would make the history books, nothing that would shift the course of nations. But in those small, quiet symbols, a resistance thrived. It wasn't a resistance of war. It wasn't a resistance of force. It was a resistance of spirit, a spirit that refused to be forgotten, even when the empire tried its hardest to erase it. Years passed. The walls of Topkapi Palace stood tall. The nuns, their names long lost to the pages of history, were left behind in the dust of time. But the walls, those silent witnesses, held their secret. And as time wore on, that secret began to surface. Archaeologists, years later, would uncover the traces left behind, the faint carvings, the scratched symbols, small relics of a time long past. What had been forgotten was now being revealed. What had been buried beneath the earth was now being unearthed. The nuns' quiet rebellion had survived. It had endured in the shadows, waiting for the moment when it would finally be seen. And when it was discovered, it wasn't a grand revelation. It wasn't an epic tale. There were no great battles, no victories to be celebrated. But in those small markings, in those whispered prayers, carved into the stone, there was something far more powerful than any historical record could ever capture. The unshakable will of a people who refused to let go of their faith. Their story was not one of loud proclamations or heroic deeds. It was a story of survival, of quiet endurance, of a belief that could not be erased, no matter how hard the world tried. It wasn't just about faith in God. It was about faith in themselves. Faith that, no matter how much was taken from them, their spirit would endure. The marks on the walls were not just symbols. They were a message that said, "We were here," a message that said, "You cannot erase us," a message that echoed through the centuries, quietly, but with undeniable force. The nuns had been forgotten by the world, erased from the history books, their names never spoken, but in the silent carvings, in the marks they had left behind, they had written their own history, and it was one that no empire, no conqueror, no time itself could ever erase. So, while the records may have been rewritten, while the walls of history may have tried to shut them out, the nuns' legacy lived on. Not in grand monuments or written words, but in the quiet, enduring strength of their faith, a faith that, in the end, was all they truly had, and in that they were never forgotten. The air is still now, and the echoes of the past begin to fade, yet the whispers of the nuns linger in the silence. In the dark corners of Topkapi Palace, where cold stone walls held secrets too deep to speak, the sound of prayers never ceased, a quiet rebellion, a defiance that could not be erased. It's a strange thing, isn't it? How history tries to forget, but sometimes it is the quietest moments that hold the loudest truths. And as we sit here now, in the comfort of this present moment, we are reminded that even the smallest act of faith, the softest whisper, can echo through time. If this story moved you, if the quiet strength of these women resonates with something deep within, then I invite you to pause for a moment and let their voices echo through the stillness, their faith, their resilience, their refusal to be forgotten. If you believe in the power of silent resistance, in the strength that comes from standing firm in your beliefs, please take a moment to like this video, share it with those who need to hear it, and subscribe to our channel. Together, we can keep their story alive, so that the whispers of their courage reach even further. Let their voices be heard again, for they are not lost to history. They are with us still, in every quiet act of defiance. Goodbye, and we will meet again.